I want to talk to you a little bit in this video about a significant stressor that all honeybee colonies encounter at some point in their existence, and that stressor is called robbing. You'll hear beekeepers talk about robbing all the time, and robbing behavior is real simple. It's where bees from one colony go to another colony and try to steal the resources from that colony. So why is it a problem? Well, it's a problem because if any colony is capable of being robbed, it's probably already stressed, which means the robbing bees can cause significant damage. They can steal all of the resources. You might see fighting at the nest entrance, and colonies that are heavily robbed can collapse altogether. So you can lose bees and colonies this way. Even the strong colonies can suffer from robbing behavior, because if it was a disease or a pest or something like that that caused that one colony to become weak enough to be robbed, the robbing bees might come to that colony and pick up those diseases and pests to take back with them to their colony. So lots and lots of things can happen when colonies engage in robbing behavior. So I want to talk a little bit about how to recognize robbing behavior, how to prevent robbing behavior, and then if it's already happening in your apiary, how to stop it. So I'll start by saying that robbing behavior doesn't typically occur throughout the year. It tends to be seasonal. So for example, when there's a lot of abundant resources available in the environment that bees are collecting and bringing into their nest, they're not really going after resources from other colonies. They're not invading other hives to steal resources from the colonies living in those hives. Instead, you tend to see robbing behavior increase in periods of nectar dearth. Bees don't really steal propolis from one another or pollen from one another. So when I talk about robbing behavior, I'm really talking about stealing carbohydrate resources, or in the typical honeybee colony's case, that's nectar or honey. So if you think about that, the reason bees would want to rob in the first place is because there's usually a nectar dearth happening at the time that the bees want to leave their hives and go to another one and steal the resources in it. So you don't typically see it in spring when you get your major nectar flow. You start seeing it usually in midsummer, and it will go through summer until a fall flow happens and provides resources for bees to go after. But the seasonality associated with it means that you can anticipate that robbing's just around the corner, so you're going to have to tighten up your management practices so that you can prevent it in the first place. So how do you spot robbing at a hive? So I've got this hive here that I want to show you what I mean when I talk about robbing. So we look at this hive, it looks absolutely normal. It's got a deep brood box, a medium super, a feeder jar, a bottom board, etc. So robbing, again, is when bees from one colony are coming to this hive to steal the resources from the colony that lives in it. So this hive is still alive though. The bees in this hive are still alive. The colony is still functioning. So bees may be coming and going. They may be foraging. So typical behavior at a colony entrance is directional movement. Bees going out with purpose. Bees coming in with purpose. When you start seeing bees hover around the hive, especially in areas that are not the entrance, you can bet that bees are looking for a way into that hive. So for example, you might see cracks and crevices between boxes. These two boxes here have a gaping hole right here. If you see bees hovering or fighting going into and out of that hole, they might be robbing bees. If you see bees hovering around the side of the boxes where the two boxes come together at the seam, or maybe right up under the lid of the hive, these bees might be looking for an entrance into that hive. I chose specifically this lid as well because when you use migratory lids and they warp in the sun, you can often get gaps between the lid and the hive body that the bees can infiltrate. So essentially, I spot robbing when I see bees trying to get into the nest anywhere that's not the entrance. So maybe they're working here at the bottom of the feeder jar. Maybe they're going under the lid or this gap here between these two boxes. Now, robbing also happens at the nest entrance, and the telltale sign that it's happening at the entrance is when you see bees fighting. And not just one or two bees, but multiple bees fighting. But in a true robbing situation, bees not only try to get into the nest entrance, they'll also try to get into the seams of the boxes under the lid around the feeder jars. So when you see that activity, you can assume the colony in this hive is getting robbed. So now that you know a lot about robbing, you can recognize, you know when it's going to happen, you see bees engaging in that behavior, you can anticipate it because of the seasonal information that I provided for you. Let me talk then now about how to prevent robbing. Preventing robbing is a lot better than having to fix it later on. So let's use this hive as an example and let's pretend there's a colony living within it. One of the key ways to prevent robbing is to ensure that all of the colonies in your apiary are led by good queens, the colonies are equally strong, and they have the same amount of abundant resources available in the nest. That makes any one colony unlikely to be a target of other colonies in the apiary because it's as strong as they are. It has the resources that they have. All of those are good things. Also, if you think about prevention, especially as you approach the robbing season, it's always a good idea when you work colonies, when you go into these hives, to work them as quickly and as efficiently as possible. If you're working colonies during robbing season and you take off the lid and you're slowly doing your thing and you go over here and do this and then you might meander over there before you come back, you're leaving this colony in this hive vulnerable to attention from robbers. So you want to work this hive, take it apart, do what you're in there to do, and then put it back together as quickly as possible. That's always a great idea when working colonies during robbing season. In fact, you can take additional steps. As an example, when you are working this hive during robbing season and you don't want to look in the honey super, what you can do is leave that super completely intact with the lid on it and sit it inside of another lid, like a telescoping lid here. Now I can work this box, and this box is the only one that's available to robbers, whereas this box is completely protected, both from the bottom and from the top. It's very common for beekeepers as they work hives to take boxes and leave them out in the open. They might turn them up like this, and this just gives so many different entry points for robbing bees. So if I was working this hive during robbing season, I would ensure that I have that super that I remove completely protected so that while I'm here, that's the only exposed area of this nest. Another thing that you can do during robbing season is you can reduce the entrances of colonies. Now, you can purchase entrance reducers from bee equipment manufacturers. They usually have a large opening and a much smaller opening. You can put the entrance reducer right over the entrance of the hive, and you're essentially restricting the entrance and giving bees less entrance to have to patrol or defend. And again, if you really want to be worried about it, you can restrict it to the smallest entrance. I just tend to reserve the smallest entrance for things like wintertime. I don't like to restrict it very small if it's really hot in the summertime. Another good management idea to prevent robbing is when you are working colonies in robbing season, even if you have entrance reducers on, even if you take your supers off and protect them while you're working the colony, is don't work more than one colony at a time. The more colonies that you have open, the more you start that feeding frenzy in robbing season. If you're going to work the colony in this hive, you work the colony in this hive. Why do I say that? Well, it's very common for beekeepers to swap brood out between colonies, and they may have lids from multiple hives open. They might be exchanging supers between multiple hives. All of that aroma of nectar and honey in the air can cause bees to want to come and rob these other colonies. So don't work more than one at a time. You also want to equalize your colonies in the apiary to ensure that they are of equal strength. Because when colonies are equal strength, you're not usually having weaker ones in the apiary that are vulnerable to having to fight off other robber bees. Another good way to prevent robbing is to think about the colony in this box. Again, this one has a deep brood box, a medium super, and if I were to go inside of this and the colony was confined really to just 3 or 4 frames in this bottommost box, they would not need all of this space. In fact, they can't patrol it and protect it. So what I might do is condense this colony from this full-size box to a nuke. restrict its entrance, to give it less space that it has to defend. Another really good idea, and something that absolutely drives bees crazy from a robbing perspective, is managing how you apply sugar water to colonies. Robbing can really be excited and instigated in nectar dearths when you are feeding bees, because the bees have no resources to go after, so they're going after the resources that you put in the apiary. And let's just pick on this jar, for example. We know that this feeder jar has 2 holes in it. I could put it here on the hive, and the bees inside that hive can drink it. Now, a lot of people will take that nectar jar, pick it up, turn it over, and take it all the way to the hole, and they're just dripping nectar or dripping sugar water all the way to that hole. And you drip, 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 drip. You place the feeder jar. Now you've got sugar water here. If you weren't careful when you filled this jar with sugar water, you may have sugar water running down this jar. And now you've given a neon sign to the other bees in the apiary saying, come here. If you drip sugar water in an apiary, that is going to incite robbing behavior. And that's even the case if this colony is not strong enough to take it, and something like the hole in the jar touches a little bit of wax on the comb, that can cause the jar to drip, 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 drip in the hive. And if you've got a screen bottom board, it can drip out of the bottom of the hive, which calls attention there. So managing your feeding, I'm not saying don't feed. Sometimes feeding helps reduce that robbing tendency. I'm just saying if you feed, you've got to make sure your jars aren't sticky, that you're not releasing any sugar water in the apiary. All of that will cause a massive robbing outbreak. Another good recommendation to reduce robbing, especially during robbing season, is work colonies later in the day. And I know this sounds a little bit strange, but what I find with robbing is that it's often reset the next day. So for example, if I were working a series of colonies at say 2 in the afternoon and it's in the middle of robbing season and there's no resources coming in and I'm slowly moving throughout the apiary, the bees are going to start robbing one another very significantly. And I might not be able to bring that robbing under control until nighttime or the next day. So if you work bees later in the day, there's less time for them to get excited and less time for them to stay excited and engage in that robbing behavior. So working bees, but an hour or so before the sun goes down gives them less time to gear up that robbing behavior and hopefully pushes the reset button as they're in their colony at nighttime and they don't come out first thing the next morning ready to rob again. So my final advice for preventing robbing in the apiary is think about how we are as beekeepers and hygienic behavior in the apiary. What do I mean by hygienic behavior? Well, we open up this box, we scrape combs, we throw it out, we have a broken frame with a big chunk of wax, we throw it over there. We're constantly taking stuff out of the hive and we're making the apiary not so hygienic, right? And any of these resources that we put into the apiary can cause robbing. If we're dripping frames of honey, if we're cutting off burr comb and throwing it on the ground, all of these things can get attention from robbing bees. So keeping these basic recommendations in mind really go a long way to limiting or preventing the occurrence of robbing. So now that you know a little bit about preventing robbing, what do you do if it's already happening in the apiary? How do you stop it? Well, if it's bad enough, it may be very difficult to stop. So I'll give you some pointers here that you can keep in mind if you see it happening, what you can do to try to bring it under control before it gets out of hand. Something caused that robbing. The hive was open, you dripped a lot of syrup in transit to the hive that you were feeding, you put burr comb full of honey on the ground. So the first thing that you need to do to bring that robbing under control once it's happened is eliminate the stimulus. Find whatever it is they're going after and stop bee access to it. So for example, with these types of feeder jars, you'll often get bees heavily congregating right at the bottom of the glass, right where the metal lid touches. If that is a problem, if you're causing a lot of attention here that's spilling over to the rest of the hive, then you may have to feed another day. You take the jar off, you cover up the hole. If for some reason you dripped sugar syrup all the way to this hive and they're going after that, you may have to wipe it clean. If having this hive open is causing other bees to come to it and you're getting a lot of attention in the apiary, you may have to close the hive. Remove the stimulus, remove the stimulus, remove the stimulus. The second recommendation in this regard is bees can't get into a hive through entrances that don't exist. So you might close that hole, you might close this hole, maybe other places around these seams bees are getting in. That's why it's always good to have a roll of tape that you can tape over these holes to limit bee access in there. Restrict the entrance on your hive if you see robbing happening. If it's bad enough, you can even default to the smallest possible entrance. You don't have to use these entrance reducers that you can purchase from equipment manufacturers. Really, any block of wood to close that entrance or restrict that entrance would be really good. I've had robbing so bad in apiaries before that I've had to restrict hive entrances to single bees, one bee going out and one bee coming in. So you can use blocks of wood to restrict the entrance. There are even really great available robbing screens that you can purchase from equipment manufacturers that fit over the entrance of hives, and that bees that coming in to rob might be attracted to the entrance down here, but you open upper entrances that bees can escape that are functioning in this nest. They're flying in and out of these opening while all the robbers are just attracted down here. So there's lots of things that you can do at the nest entrance to restrict bee access. Also things you can do at the hive to restrict bee access. Some beekeepers have even reported that misting colonies or sprinkling colonies with water can reduce robbing behavior. It's really kind of the rain principle. Robbing behavior always stops during the rain because bees quit foraging, and that rain, like nighttime, almost resets that behavior. The bees stop doing it and don't, quote, remember to do it after the rain. I'm not saying that's advisable. It's certainly not something you can always do, but doing something like that may help. Now, let's say that you've prevented the best you can. Let's say you've seen it and you've tried to stop it the best you can. But even through preventing and even through the tricks I gave you for stopping, the bees don't stop robbing. What's the next step? Well, the next step is moving the affected colonies. Either moving those colonies that are so weak that they're struggling to keep up with the robbing pressure, move them to another apiary, or move out the couple of strong colonies that are engaged most in the behavior. You can usually recognize those because they're going to have the most activity at the colony entrance where they're flying in and out of the hive. But that's a last step recommendation, is having to move those bees. It's always best to keep colonies strong, limit how you handle sugar syrup in the apiary, control other openings. All of those things are better answers, because once you have to move colonies, once it's that bad, sometimes colonies can be too gone to be remedied at that point. So if I'm looking at this hive here and I've done all of these things, I've reduced the entrance, I was careful about how I've fed it, I've closed up the openings and it's still being robbed, now I have to make a management decision about this colony. Is it worth saving? Should I spread its resources to other bees in the apiary? Or should I just take this colony in its hive somewhere else to prevent robbing? The good news is robbing is not as bad as something like starvation or varroa or foul brood. You'll see it in your apiaries, but hopefully something that I've told you in this video will help you prevent it in the first place. But if you see it, stop it once it happens. You're going to see it, you're going to encounter it, and you're going to have to address it at some point in your beekeeping tenure. But it is manageable with these tricks of the trade that I provided in this video.